Call this work session of the Anchorage Assembly to order. We'll start with roll call. Ms. Alatal.
Meg Zalatal, Suzanne France, Crystal Kennedy, Austin Quinn Davidson,
John Waddleton, Felix Rivera,
Forrest Dunbar.
Pete Peterson.
Right.
On the phone.
Christopher Constant.
Anyone else on the phone? Okay. Thank you all for coming. This is a lot more crowded than I was expecting. But this work session was called by myself and Ms. Quinn Davidson to discuss matters related to restoring water to the Eklutna, and I believe that Ms. Quinn Davidson will take us away.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. Mr. Dunbar and I set this work session up so that the Assembly could get a comprehensive update from involved parties and better understand the efforts underway to restore water to the Eklutna River. As many of you know, there were 2 dams on the Eklutna River. One defunct dam down lower toward the highway, and one up above at the lake itself. In the summer of 2018, after a monumental fundraising effort to raise $7.5 million and gathering the support of a number of organizations, including the Native Village of Eklutna, Eklutna Inc., the Conservation Fund, Rasmussen, HDR, Patagonia, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Trout Unlimited, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the state of Alaska, and others, the lower dam was removed. The removal meant that the Eklutna River could finally become a river again. There was once again hope that fish would move up the river as they had for generations before. As the Native Village of Eklutna put it, we are hopeful the salmon will return to us. Around the country, as dams have been removed, we've seen salmon populations return to those rivers. The problem here is that there is no water in the river, and that's why we're here today. 90% of the water taken from the lake is used for power generation, despite the fact that it only produces 2% of power in South Central Alaska. ML&P currently owns 52%, majority share, in the Eklutna Power Project. Only 10% of the water taken from the lake is used for drinking water. There's a complicated history on this river, including a 1991 agreement that established a delayed schedule to mitigate the impacts of the dam. This agreement notably excluded the Native Village of Eklutna, as well as Eklutna Inc. So we're here today to learn more about that, more about the river, and to hear from a number of parties involved in this issue. We will explore an immediate flushing flow that could clear sediment left behind from the removed dam, making way for fish to return, as well as full water flow restoration itself. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar.
Great. So we have several documents before us. Do you have a preference on which we'll have presented first?
Here's the order of speakers.
Okay.
So they could probably speak about their documents.
Wonderful, thank you. So first we'd like to hear from Chief Aaron Leggett of the Native Village of Eklutna. Mr. Leggett, would you mind coming forward? And when I ask you to speak, if you could, whomever, speak loudly so people in the back can hear, and also we can record you. If you identify yourself for the record, appreciate it too.
Hello, everybody. This is Aaron Leggett. Yali Esmanda, Shishida Aaron Leggett Gashkanak, Shi Chada Dananak, Shi Nolchina Esman, Chu Idla Ratchkayachdi, Shtuka Rick Leggett, Chunkda Diane Bowles, Shu Cheyenne Beatty. Again, my name is Aaron Leggett. I'm currently the president of the Native Village of Eklutna, and I've been involved with the Native Village of Eklutna going on 13 years, I believe, and I've been the president for the last 2. In all my years of being involved with the tribe, one of our biggest goals has been to remove this deadbeat dam on the Eklutna River, and after concerted effort working with many stakeholders and the support of Eklutna Inc., I'm also a board member for Eklutna Inc., and many others, we were able to take out the dam. When I first got involved with the tribal council, the Army Corps of Engineers was interested in doing a study about looking at the lower river and how parts of it could be rerouted, but ultimately that was put on hold because it was realized that it would be kind of wasting money until the dam was taken out, and ultimately getting more water down the river was going to also be needed. Late last year, the native village of Eklutna put a resolution together called Flek Kink to Des, which means we're hopeful that the salmon will return to us. And essentially what we're saying is that this river has sustained the native village of Eklutna for at least 1,000 years, and we're hopeful that it will continue to. Sadly, because the native village of Eklutna sits within the municipality of Anchorage and we're in a non-subsistence zone, we don't have access to the same amount of fish as we would typically. And so our hope is that we can get more fish into the river. It's also not a big secret that the salmon runs in Upper Cook Inlet in my lifetime have dropped off. What once used to be a thriving sport fishing industry on the Little Sioux and Montana Creek and Alexander Creek are gone. And I don't see those coming back unless we do things to start doing salmon restoration. There have been some efforts that have been done, but the opportunity to put a salmon producing stream in Upper Cook Inlet, I think, would be a huge boost to the overall health of the Cook Inlet salmon.
Thank you, Mr. Leggett. If you don't mind just hanging out at the table, we'll have other people speak too. Does anyone else have a question for Mr. Leggett before we move on to our next speaker? Okay, thank you. And feel free to chime in as we go through, if you don't mind. Is there Mr. Is it Liebeck or Liebeck? Would you mind coming up and talking to us a little bit? We have a document here from my colleagues, which is the in-stream flow study. Would you mind identifying yourself and talking us through the study?
We have a hand here as well. Great. Yes, I'm Trent Liebeck. I'm with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Habitat Restoration Program in the Anchorage field office. And thank you for inviting us here today. It's a pleasure to be here and hopefully provide you guys with some good information. So as I said, I work in the Habitat Restoration Program. We do a lot of work with salmon habitat, fish passage, and just general conservation activities tied to salmon restoration. On our staff, we have several different biologists, hydrologists, engineers that are involved in those projects. So with us today, we also have Heather Hansen, and she's an engineer in the program. And what we wanted to talk about was some of the survey work we've done and a preliminary fish habitat flow assessment. So Heather's going to provide a couple-minute update on that.
Thanks, Trent. Thanks for allowing me to come explain my paper to you, what Trent helped do the survey on, so it's good to have him here. So I just passed out a handout with some photos that I think will help illustrate what I'm going to talk about. We went out to look at the historical channel that exists below the upper dam and but above the dam that was taken out, basically, so that reach of the river. And by looking at that channel, we hope to be able to understand what the historical flows might have been before the dams were constructed. So we did 2 study reaches. The first study reach, October 2018, and figure 2 shows where those were. We found that there was quite a bit of sediment in that reach, and that's about 1.5 miles above the lower dam. And we actually didn't really expect to see sediment that far above the lower dam. And so that kind of spurred, let's go out and get a lot higher and see if we can get above all that sediment. So we went out and did a second study reach just below the upper dam. We're able to get into more of a natural pre-impact channel. But in all of them going out and looking at this, what we found was there was actually a lot of sediment between the lower and upper dam and the river itself that doesn't appear to be related to the lower dam. It's actually sediment that's coming out of several side canyons and has accumulated because of 50, 60, 70 years of no flow. So the flow just hasn't been there to move that sediment. So it's not just the accumulation behind the lower dam. And figure 3 shows the study reach that we looked at. So we did some real preliminary flow assessment on that, looking at for depth of flow that would support salmon spawning and incubation, how much flow would take to fill up that lower channel to a reasonable level, or that upper channel to a reasonable level. That was intended just as a starting point to kind of understand historically what had been there and to understand what the flows might end up being, or something to shoot for. Figure 4 just kind of really understand the level of sediment that's coming out of some of these side canyons. Just kind of, it's a look up an alluvial fan into one of these canyons, and as you can see, or I apologize for the quality of these graphics, but can't afford ink for a printer. But yeah, it's just really eroded a lot of, it's basically former lake bed materials there that are being washed down. And figure 5, that's kind of midway up the canyon, or up the upper channel there. And that figure just shows the original channel is basically full of sediment, and that's why it's super shallow in that area, and we're not seeing really any channel shape at all.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Weldon?
So, you're trying to figure out what it used to look like and what it should, or, I mean, is this a picture of, that's about how much water we'd expect to be in there, but it's got more silt than we...
No, that's not.
What can we expect to, what's our goal here? What would it look like? Chester Creek or Fish Creek?
Well,
Ship Creek?
our hydrologists believe that this was really close to Eagle River inside.
To Eagle River?
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
So the water that you're seeing in figure 5 is actually just groundwater. It's only a couple inches deep, and it's spread over these silt materials that have filled the channel up. So all of this is pictures of the impacted dam. There's much of the upper river, as you can see in figure 6, has no water in it at all. So we were able to look at that historical channel and compare that to, we have some gauge data that came from the pre-dam era, 1947, I believe. So we were able to compare the historical channel with that gauge data. We have a pretty good idea of what that historical channel was. But that only exists for maybe half a mile, and then it starts to be very impacted by all these different sediment sources. So I guess, basically, from what we were seeing, we feel that additional flows would be really helpful, flushing flows, to help get some of that sediment out of there and prepare for whatever the future holds there.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you. May is typically kind of one of our drier months anyway. We don't really see a lot of snow melting there until even July. And I know Eagle River itself fluctuates like that. So do you have any numbers that show this at its, whatever it's been, its maximum flow rate over the last few years? Like what it looks like in August, or anything to compare to?
Yeah, so there hasn't been any, we looked at groundwater flows. We did go out and measure that last summer, and we're talking about 5 to 10 CFS is what we're getting from groundwater, and basically what's inside the canyon. Basically, there's almost no flow in the river because there's no flow coming over the upper dam. That would be the source of most of the flow of this river. So base level flows, I would say, is about 10 CFS.
So for those of us that aren't hydrologists,
What's that
Yeah.
compared to?
what is 10 CFS versus what is Eagle River typically? How
Oh yeah,
if
so
there's a full river, what's a full river?
100 CFS.
And so when you talk about a flushing flow, what volume of water are you talking about?
Well, I think that's something that really has to be decided between the different parties and agencies. It's not something that I would want to throw on the table. as far as, exact volume of water. But we are talking about to move debris and sediment, we need something that's over the bank full level. It's more like a flood level. It can be for a short period of time, but yeah, it's going to be a higher level of load.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Mr. Constant, and then Ms. Kennedy.
Yeah, thanks. But what's missing from this is what is a minimum level to achieve that goal? And so can you help us to understand what a minimum flow rate would be to achieve the flushing flow?
Not at this time. I think more research and analysis is needed for that.
So can you give us kind of a work plan or a sketch of how we might achieve that understanding? It doesn't have to be off the fly. It could be in a follow-up.
Yeah. And my paper kind of talks about future needs that are needed to really understand more, and it's more survey, more mapping, hydraulic modeling, sediment transport modeling. So it's engineering type analysis.
Yeah, and if I might, we kind of understand that, and the challenge is figuring out what would it cost, how much water would it take at a minimum for us to do this. Because once we have a benchmark level, I assure you we could get to the task of finding the funds and getting the will to flow the water. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. I would say, there are sort of two distinct numbers too, right? There's the flushing flow number, like how much water you need to run a flushing flow and get an appreciable amount of sediment out. And then there's the follow-up question, which is what is the minimum amount of water do we need to permanently run through this riverbed to have a sustainable fishery? Ms. Kennedy, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if it was last summer or the summer before, but the USGS did quite a bit of research in the lake. And I know they were looking for the sediment, what had actually fallen off of the sides and where it had settled and things like that. Have you coordinated any kind of data with them and just kind of compared studies and tried to see if there was any information in their most recent research that would be helpful in helping you decide or determine what's going on and what's actually happening?
I have been out there with USGS folks and NOAA, and we've had them review these documents.
So everybody's comparing notes?
We are
good.
working together, we're comparing
Great,
notes. So Trent suggested one thing I could, as far as baseline and kind of understanding volumes of flow. In my paper, I talk about bankful flows and suggest that that would be a good flushing flow on an annual basis. And so that is 1,400 CFS is an average bankful flow. And that bankful flow generally corresponds to the 2-year flood flow. And so I'm saying 1,400 CFS for 1 day per year. So you would have to divide that by 365 to get, translate that to an annual CFS, if that makes sense. So
Yeah,
divide 1,400 by 365.
If you think about those channel flows and what bankful is, and we were looking at the channel morphology and trying to understand what the river used to look like, right, when there was water in there. So bankful is one of those physical features that you can see on the landscape. And if you go back to figure 3 in that handout Heather provided, bankful is actually up in the forest in that picture, right? So it's important to remember that. You see that photo and you see a very small, what looks like a small stream. In reality is there's been 70 years of vegetation growing back into that old riverbed. I think it's important to make sure we all understand that. Historic bankful, that 2-year kind of flood frequency or 1 or 2 year flood frequency is looking like it might have been 1,400, maybe 1,500 CFS. I think Heather's noting that 1,400 as an average. That's still not the high flood, those larger flood events. There was more than that at times. And I think that's some of the question we're a little hesitant to say what were those more extreme flows or larger flood events. That gets harder to identify that.
Thank you. So we have a question by Ms. Quinn Davidson. I'd like to move on. We have several more speakers, and hopefully everybody will hang around for more questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So my understanding is that the lake actually was flooding this fall. There was a lot of water. It was even eroding trails around the side, but none of it was released down the river. Can you talk about whether that would have been a good idea and why it might not have happened? And then the second piece is that my understanding is the longer the sediment sits, the harder it will be to flush it out, and that time is somewhat of the essence. So could you cover those?
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's I can't tell you why there were no flushing flows go down.
Would it have been a good idea?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That
thank
would
you.
be great. And what was your second question? Oh,
About sediment
this
and how long it
sediment
sits and.
Well, the longer it sits, the more sediment comes down from the canyons to carry away. So, yeah, time is of the essence.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn-Davidson. Okay, so we're going to move on now to Mr. Ron Benkert from the Department of Fish and Game to talk about restoration efforts on the river. If you guys could see. All right, there might be more questions for you. No, it's fine. You can go back there. Thank you. Go ahead. Usually our work sessions aren't quite this popular. You usually have plenty of chairs.
Well, my name's Ron Benkert. I'm the regional supervisor for the habitat section at Fish and Game Central Region. We've been working on this project for several years now. I really thank you guys for the opportunity to talk about it here because it's a great project. My portion of this is restoration, and a couple things have been touched upon which I'd like to expand upon a little bit. We are entering into negotiations for mitigation for the project, and I think I'll leave that to the utilities to cover that at the end here. But obviously one of the big focuses is getting water down the channel, which historically been pretty dry here. Which I think if that does become the preferred alternative, that's a great idea. It's just not water that we need to look at, though. Obviously, as was just alluded to by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, there's encroachment of riparian vegetation in the channel now. If you look at a lot of other similar systems where this type of thing has occurred, where you've got restriction of flows because of water, potable water supply, what have you, when you have this length of time that the channel is basically adjusted to having that low flow condition, so the riparian zone encroaches onto what was typically the bankful area. We probably need to look at how we might need to do some vegetation management through there, or if you leave that vegetation there, it will basically probably cause some down cutting and just narrowing of the channel, confinement of the channel. So that might be one thing we need to look at. We've identified barriers along the channel, which obviously you can put as much water as you want down there, but if the fish can't get over the barriers, they're not going to get very far up the channel. When we were working with Eklutna Inc. last year, they had to walk some equipment up there. There was 2 landslides that came down below the old dam, the lower dam. As they moved through there, we asked them to try to see if they could manipulate those landslides a little bit. They needed to do something to get the equipment through. One of them has been partially removed. The one up above is still a barrier. We did fish sampling up there this last fall. We've extended anadromy for both Chinook and Co. up to that upper barrier, which is only a couple hundred yards downstream from the old dam site. So just manipulation of that landslide right there could potentially move juvenile fish way farther upstream than they're currently inhabiting in the channel right now. We've also documented, spawning chum salmon below Thunderbird Creek confluence. Everybody knew they were there, but they hadn't actually been put into our anadromous waters catalog, so now they're in the catalog. So that section of the river supported stronger protections under our statutes. Just wanted to address the flushing flow. We think that's a great idea, but the timing is everything on this because we do have spawning fish downstream from here. We would want to coordinate that amount of water because it's going to move a lot of sediment down the creek. And the last thing we want to do is have a bunch of fine sediment land on spawning areas and basically smother those reds. So timing of a flushing flow would be important to the department to determine when that would be most appropriate to do. But we have been monitoring the site for the last couple of years. We've been working with Eklutna Inc. pretty closely on that. We have seen some pretty dramatic changes in the channel below. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been focusing primarily upstream of the whole dam, and we've been looking downstream. I know that the Ticklewood Village folks, Mark Lamoureux and his group, has been canvassing the whole river, doing habitat typing, and I haven't seen Mark's results, but I'm sure as they went up the channel looking at the different habitat features, they have probably identified additional areas that could potentially be barriers that we could address, maybe providing some in-stream structure and some more diverse habitat within the system in conjunction with augmented flows, if that's the way we go. So I think there's a lot of different pieces of it that we need to look at other than just putting water down the channel. We have to, a lot of other little adjustments we'll need to do or consider as we move through the process. Obviously the core study was addressed here, and they didn't look really above that lower dam because at that time in 2011 they didn't really think there was much chance of that structure being removed. But they do have some great ideas from there on down. I brought that report for you guys. If you don't have it available, I can send it to you too. That's worth taking a look at. Some of the techniques and methods that they're looking at for the lower system could also be applied to the upper channel. So I think that there's a lot of work to do, but I think it could all complement one another. So it's not just water. We need to look at the habitat features as well, and obviously the passage issue.
Thank you, Ron. So we have a couple questions. Ms. Quinn-Davidson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you said it would be important to make sure we do it at the right time. When is the right time? And then how soon could we get a coordinated effort with all the things you mentioned to make sure that we're doing it in the right way? What's stopping us from doing that now?
Well, basically the chums are moving in there sometime in late July, primarily in August, so we probably prefer to see a springtime flushing flow. That almost mimics the natural hydrograph anyway. We have these spring freshets come down anyhow. And so, the channel between the old dam and the confluence of Thunderbird Creek is pretty anemic. There's not much we can do about sediment accumulating there. Although we have noted on our surveys we've been doing the last couple of years, it's gone from really embedded large substrate, which doesn't do any good for spawning or anything, and embeddedness, you've got large boulders and cobbles, and only about this much of them are sticking up out of the stream channel, and you can barely pry one out with a crowbar. So they can't dig reds or anything in that. Since the dam has been removed, we've seen an accrual of sediment, finer gravels over the top of that. We haven't seen any large gravel yet because there's just not enough stream energy, we feel, to really transport those larger diameter particle sizes or gravels down in that reach between the old dam and Thunderbird. Obviously, Thunderbird conveys a lot, probably, I don't know what it is, 80% of the flow now. That cleans itself up pretty good there, and that's where all the spawning is. But to answer your question, we'd probably like to see something in May or June sometime before those adult fish return to spawn.
Great, thank you.
Fred?
Yeah. Now, well, where do the reds overwinter now, and what do you suspect was back before the dam?
Well, we haven't seen any adults above the confluence. Hi, Fred. I didn't see you sitting there.
That's what you do, Noah.
We haven't noted any adults above the confluence of Thunderbird Creek. We've got, I can't give you the exact numbers, but we did find a lot of juvenile coho and chinook. Not a lot, but significant number between there and that barrier below the lower dam. So we know that those fish the juveniles are somewhat utilizing that stretch between Thunderbird and the barrier, but we suspect that most of the productivity and most of the juvenile overwintering and rearing is probably happening from Thunderbird down to below the Glen Highway.
So what do you think it was before the dams?
Oh, I'm sure that they went all the way up there.
Overwintered the lake.
If they got to the lake, then I'm sure they probably did get to the lake. They were overwintering the lake. Obviously there's other species out there that don't usually use the lake so much, but there's other areas in the system that they would have probably been using in overwintering. There's a lot more water in the channel. There's deep pools and things that develop that they could actually overwinter in the river itself.
Thank you, Ron. We have 3 more speakers, so if you don't want to, you can just stay right there. Next, we have Mr. Rick Sinott. Where's Rick? Sinnott, my bad. Rick, if you could sit right there. Got an extra tough sign and everything.
He's my old bear hunter.
Nice, there's a few of those. Go ahead, Rick.
Well, thank you for having me here today. I'm here to represent the Anchorage Watershed Natural Resources Advisory Commission. We've been interested in this issue for several years, and we've had Brad Micklejohn and Eklutna Village and Trotter Limited and ACE, and I think Heather came and talked to us once or twice, and so over the last year or so, we've been getting more and more involved. And so we passed this resolution in last October, and there's a lot of whereases, and you've either heard or seen the whereases before because you have your own resolution that you used to a lot of them before we did. But basically, our resolution resolved that the Assembly and the Mayor keep leaning forward on this issue. I think you're doing a great job now. Keep the pressure on because there's a lot of inertia. And in particular, we felt that the argument that some of Heather and the hydrologists were making to have flushing flows, because that seems to be in order to move some sediment out and to better establish what the channel and side channels might have been 90 years ago, they need that water in the channel. And that's almost like, they almost need that before the things happen, because otherwise you don't even know where the channel is. It's flat now, or just a little depression. So these flushing flows, whatever they're determined to be, we felt very strongly that those need to start soon. I live by the lake, and the lake fills up, gets pretty high in August typically. That's about what time it starts to get close to the trails. And then it freezes usually at the end of November. So if you want to use gravity to help with the flushing flows and the amount of water that's in the lake, fall would be the time to do it. But I understand what Ron is saying as far as timing is important as well for the fish. The lake is like 70 feet or more below the level of the dam in spring. So there's going to have to be some pumps and stuff. If you want to get water there then, there's going to have to be some heavy-duty pumping going on. So that's just something to keep in mind. And of course, the ultimate goal is to reestablish suitable habitat for the 5 species of salmon that are found in the Ward River, and at least some of them used to get up as far as the lake, we believe. And that would also benefit the ecosystem because, as you all know, salmon, when they die, they come into streams, they spawn, they die, and then they bring tons of fertilizer. So the fertilizer helps plant diversity and abundance, which helps animal diversity and abundance, and it's good for the people, good for the animals, good for everyone. And just briefly, because I am also a former president of the Eklutna Valley Community Council and vice president, now I've been downgraded. We passed a resolution on this some time ago, the exact same issue, and we also noted, this is important to keep in mind, that the electric utilities were granted 30 years to mitigate past damages that had happened since the dams were built back in the late 20s. And so their deadline for completing all studies and implementing the recommendations of the scientists and the utilities and whoever's all working on this together is 2027. That's the deadline. But before that, all this consultation has to happen between federal and state agencies, between the electric utilities, the city. They've got to go through at least one major public process, planning review process, and it's got to be signed by the governor 3 years before 2027. So now we're talking about just a few years, 2024. And 3 years is not a lot of time in the scientific world to collect the information you need when things have been shut down for 90 years to find out, what you need to know. So time is wasted. And in fact, one of our whereases in our Eklutna Valley Community Council resolution was, whereas time is running out. Period. And so that's why we passed a resolution in 2016. That was 4 years ago. Time is running out. So I just want to emphasize that you guys are doing great. Lean on this because it's not going to happen without your support. And our resolution concluded basically the same as the Watershed Natural Resources Commission resolution, that there needs to be enough water spilled into the upper river to restore and sustain salmon.
Thank you, Mr. Sinnott. Any questions or, okay, Mrs. Alentel?
Thank you. Excuse me. So the question that's coming up as I've heard all the presentations, and I'm going to pose it to you first because you said time is running out, is what's the recommendation to the assembly to either facilitate the exchange of information or coordinate these efforts? What's the role that we should be envisioning for ourselves to get this done? I'm not hearing a lot of dispute yet or about what needs to happen, but it sounds like there are a lot of intensive efforts going on that aren't necessarily coming together.
Well, I'm not the best person to talk to about that. I think perhaps Brad and Coach John would be if he's going to be presenting today with you guys, because he has had his hand on many different strings on this thing, pulling and pushing, and he understands what's happened so far and what needs to happen better than I as far as coordination. But I mean, I think you guys are doing good work, the assembly, and just, like I say, leaning, putting pressure, making sure that these guys all get together, because you've got utilities, which is one whole world. You've got the scientists, which is another whole world. You've got the native village of Eklutna, which is another world, and Anchorage and commercial fishermen and everyone else. They're all these people inhabit different worlds, and in order to get them together to talk and coordinate and collaborate on something involves a whole lot of something, mojo. And I think you guys are helping with that, and you just have to keep the pressure up. But yeah, the MLMP is a major shareholder in this, Chugach Electric and Matanuska. They need to be funding these studies, working with the scientists, telling the scientists what they can contribute, and the scientists need to be telling those guys what they can contribute and get this thing together. And it's starting, but it's going awfully slow. This issue, like I say, has been going on for 25 years or so.
So I intend to, we started a little late, so we'll run a little past 3. We do hope to hear from Mr. Thiebert from Chugach and Mr. Izzo from Matanuska Electric. Fred, you have a question for Mr. Sinek?
Right. This is really a legal question. Is that 30-year goal out there, could someone with standing take action in civil court to force compliance with that?
I'm not an attorney, but I assume so. I mean, it was a contract. It was a contract between the 3 electrical utilities, including the city, because it was MLMP, and the federal government, basically. And I know Tom Fink was the mayor when this was signed. His name was on it. So, yeah, it's a contract, of course.
So there's the lever that compliant. I don't like to threaten people. I like carrots instead of sticks. But there's the one that can make this work and get this thing levered off high center.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. So we still have a little more time. Mr. Thieber, would you want to, maybe you could, okay, yeah, you could swap out there too.
Actually,
we have one seat right here.
What I'd like to do is, first of all, Mr. Chairman, Assembly members, my name is Lee Thiebert. I'm the CEO of Chugach Electric, and we're just one of 3 utilities. Obviously, MLP is the largest, and Matanuska Electric is here as well. We, as a group, have worked on a presentation that really describes what we call which is the 1991 agreement. So if it would indulge the Assembly, we'd like to make that presentation, and it really highlights the 1991 agreement and what the requirements are of the utilities and the involvement of the utilities with all the agencies and the stakeholders.
Could we also, so there's the legal question 1991 agreement, which we discussed at the Assembly before. I'd like to hear specifically what you're doing now to help restore the river. I'd like that question to also be addressed by you and by any other utilities that might be able to speak to. Is that
what
okay?
I'd like is Mike to go through his presentation, and we've begun the study. The Chugach Board of Directors passed a resolution in November of 2017, and they urged us to move forward on the studies ahead of time. So we're a couple of years ahead of time, and Mike's been working on this project for the last couple of years, and I think it would be good just to see, he can kind of guide you through what's been done so far and what work is left to do.
Great. Could we hit the light there? Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. Take a second. Tony Izzo is with MEA. He's the other CEO, and Anna Henderson here. She's with MLMP. So you invited them. They asked the project team to kind of step up. My name is Mike Brody. I'm the project manager. We have Tony Izzo with Tony Zellers with MEA, Paul Rizzi with Chugach, and Eugene Murray, project team, along with Julie Taskett with Chugach Communications and Matt Clarkson with legal side. hopefully I didn't miss anybody else on the team. We have others. Team, please feel free to chip in if I miss something here. First, just wanted to start out a little bit with the orientation. Up is north. Eklutna Lakes is over here. These are the existing hydroelectric project features. The dam here, the actual intake, the tunnel structure down to the powerhouse on the old highway, mile 4, and the tail race structure here. Downstream of the dam, there's a AWW, has a pipeline running down the creek bed to their treatment plant. There's 2 bridges on the DOT side from the old Glen Highway and the new Glen Highway, and then the railroad here, and then obviously Native Village and Eklutna and most of the property along the whole run of the river. A couple of you mentioned the 1991 Fish and Wildlife Agreement. This is our guiding document for the work that we're doing. It was executed in 1991. It was signed by the municipality of Anchorage, Michigan Electric, EPA, and the governor of Alaska, and a lot of federal government agencies. On the 1995, federal law allowed for the transfer of Eklutna to the utility owners. The 1991 agreement was mentioned several times throughout that. It requires that the owners evaluate the project impacts on fish and wildlife, identify some PMEs, potential protection, mitigation, and enhancement measures, and then actually evaluate these measures to see what these impacts are. And they're to be evaluated by these 8 considerations, and they're to be considered equally. As Rick was talking, there are, in 1991 agreement, there are several key dates, and it kind of determines everything. So even though this 1991 document was signed in August of 1991, the actual transaction didn't occur until October. So that set up a lot of the dates that are associated and that we're progressing with.
Sorry, Mike, it's October of 1997 the bill of sales took place. And then these are all based on that date.
Sorry, I thought I misspoke there. So the document actually requires to start the consultation process by 2022. Municipality of Anchorage, our utility boards all passed resolutions that we should accelerate this process in accordance with this 1991 agreement. So we actually started in 2019, last year, with consultations with a lot of agencies, and we've set up a lot of information, and we've collected a lot of data, tried to identify all the different data that we have that's out there that's already been done on the project. In 2020, this year, we're consolidating that information, and then we're going to sit down and develop technical work groups with the government agencies and people involved, and we're going to develop a study plan this year determining on what actually studies we have and where we're going to go from where we are today. We set aside 2021 and 22 for those study periods. Whether or not we need 2 years, we set aside 2 years for that. And then 23, 24 is, I believe Rick alluded to it, we develop a draft plan. It goes through a review process and a final plan with a review process, and then ultimately for the governor to, whoever he or she is, to make that determination of what the plan will be.
Ms. Alto?
Yeah, I have a question about this slide, if I may.
Sure.
So I see the timeline, and it feels a little redundant. I just heard about some studies that are happening. So can you kind of put into context some of the work we've just heard about that's been done and how that plays into the timeline? Because we have technical experts who've been doing studies, but then in 2021, 2022, there's going to be other studies? Like, can the work that's already be done be used?
Yes. Short
so-
answer is yes.
Okay.
And we have copies of those studies that we've put together, and we are determining where we are today for all the studies kind of combined, and then we're going to work with the agencies and determine where we need to go to make the decisions that we think we need to make.
And can I ask one follow-up on that?
Yeah, and then we got Mr. Dyson and Ms. Kennedy.
And I see that the study plan schedule has to go to the governor for approval. Where does that requirement come from?
The 1991
The
agreement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson.
Ultimately, when we get all done and it's implementation, who pays for it?
That will be the utility owners.
Pardon?
Utility owners,
Wow, thank you.
or ultimately, we're co-ops, so our members.
Yeah, everybody else has got sovereign immunity except you guys, right?
Well, that's what the document says.
All right, sorry, thank you.
Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm looking at this document, and it tells me that at least the 3 utility companies are on board with your presentation. But obviously, we've heard from a lot of other entities, and we know there's a couple of other organizations involved. So can you summarize or tell me a little bit about just the collaborative effort? How are you all working together? Is there a commission? Is there a committee? How are you all connecting with each other over this?
As part of this 1991 agreement, we've reached out, and it feeds right into my next slide here, we've reached out to these groups. The ones that are highlighted in green are the ones that are specifically required by this document, but there's many other participants that are interested in the Eklutna drainage, and we've reached out to them, and we've had consultations with these. We've invited for everybody to submit their information to us so that we can evaluate it and start looking to see what additional studies we need to do.
Okay, can I just follow up on that?
Yeah, and then
Are there regular meetings on this? Is there a roundtable kind of a thing that happens, or everybody just kind of sending information back and forth to different parties?
We set up, initially, we started early last year, and we met individually with all of these agencies. Since that time, we started in July, and we brought everybody back together for a face-to-face meeting. Now we just follow quarterly with a phone call-in where these agencies, everybody talks together. And that was specifically requested by the agencies themselves. They want to hear from each other and keep up on this project.
Okay, thank you.
Great. If we could, push forward a little bit. I think the next 2 slides I find very interesting. So let's go on. I think those are going to be the heart of the matter, especially the slide after this slide.
The next steps, 2020, just kind of formalize a little bit more from that schedule what we're going to do. We're going to compile, synthesize, and disseminate all the existing information. We're going to put it into one single document. We're going to call it an initial information packet. It's going to summarize all the existing studies that we have, and we'll submit it to all the agencies that we have out there. They'll review it, and we'll agree upon where we are as a base. And then from there, we'll do a break into technical groups, and we'll start determining what 2021 and 22 studies are going to be with those deals. So, and then by the end of this year, we know it's a pretty intensive schedule to get this study together. We need to submit that to the governor in 2020.
Doris, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So, are you planning to do the flushing flow this year?
We can get into that next slide.
Go ahead. Yeah, you can answer now. Oh, you another
Next slide.
Great.
So, okay, the elephant in the room, looking for immediate releases of water. In our studies so far, we've run into several liabilities, hurdles that we feel like the 1991 agreement puts up for us. The first one is actually in the 1991 agreement. Section 7 identifies that water usage of fish and wildlife are strictly prohibited for that flow. Secondly, there's a lot of what we talked about with looking when these flows are going to be. Fish and Game will want to have flows, maybe Army Corps of Engineers. So these are things we kind of need to look into. we have some concerns. The civil liability, just from flushing things down the river. We have some construction debris that remains in there, plus just the large amount of silt there. We feel like there's a lot of liability on that. For one, maybe including the downstream fish areas, or when we consulted with DOT and the railroad, they expressed real concern with additional silt down, potentially undermining their structures. These are just liability hurdles that we've identified, and before we release water, we want to study these and broach that.
So could you go back one slide for a second? I want to talk about 1991. So the position of the utilities, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the 1991 agreement designed to mitigate harms to fish and wildlife that was done without the consultation of Eklutna now actually legally prohibits you from taking actions to mitigate damage to fish and wildlife.
What it says is we cannot do any release before we go through all the steps of the 1991 agreement.
Okay. Ms. Kennedy?
And just real simple, just yes or no, has there been any information, any studies on how that potential extra sediments could even impact the Port of Alaska and dredging opportunities there?
Yeah.
No, okay. Haven't got that far down yet. It all goes out.
Yeah, I apologize. I just want to make something really clear, if you can bear with me. There are three significant concerns we have. One is the issue with the 1991 agreement, where it has specific statements about release of water. That is a significant hurdle. But then there's also permitting. We have a reservation for the water, use it for generating power. We don't have purposeful permitting to do other things with it, so if we use it for other purposes, that's a significant concern. And then there's also the concern if there's any damages or impact associated with that. Potentially, you're creating liability associated with that. But three significant concerns with release. And as noted before by Mr. Sinnott and others, potential impacts really need a lot of study and what they might be and how we would advance all this. So these are concerns and they need to be addressed.
Thank you. We have Mr. Leggett and then Ms. Quinn Davidson.
For any of the potential damages to the downstream facilities and properties, or have any of those been constructed since 1991 or put in place after the agreement was signed?
The old Glen Bridge. Yeah.
So then, hypothetically, wouldn't the potential damages you would only be, it's like building in a floodplain, basically. Is one way of thinking of it, the way I think
I would just think the utility owners, just being prudent, would look for liability releases prior to anything.
Right, yeah, no, I understand that, but I'm just merely pointing out that the agreement was known, the old Glen Bridge was rehabilitated, knowing that this agreement existed. I don't know the potential for this.
So for those who might not have been able to hear in the back, what Mr. Leggett stated was that things were built in the floodplain knowing that this release might have happened in the future. Is that accurate? Thank you. So Ms. Quinn Davidson, then Ms. Zalatel. And again, if folks could try to project into the back, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought Forrest phrased it really well. So can you just to make it crystal clear, the agreement does not allow you to do a flush and flow?
It doesn't specifically state the term flush and flow.
Oh, okay. So where in the agreement does it, can you?
Section 7,
Okay.
and actually I'll read it to you in the third one here, is, and of course there's the whole context of the agreement, but I'll read the specific phrase here. In addition, prior to undertaking any major structural or operational modifications substantially affecting water usage or fish and wildlife at the project, purchasers shall follow the process called for in sections 2 through 6 of this agreement. And I strongly suggest that those of you who have not read the agreement, it's a very significant document for everything to happen on this river
and the watershed. Sections 2 through 6 are forming, it talks all about the studies and what needs to be done, working with the agencies, developing the plan, and getting to the point where you propose to the governor a PME program, Protect, Mitigate, and Enhancement Program for Fish and Wildlife.
So may I follow up, Mr.
Yeah.
Chair? So I would probably argue that that's not what the intent of that was. It was to protect fish and wildlife, whereas releasing the flushing flow would actually do that. But assuming you're correct, can you just walk us through what exactly you're doing on this list to move us forward in the flushing flow right now?
Right. Well, I go back to earlier in the presentation. This is why we've had 3 resolutions from the utilities to accelerate this. So we're doing this, if you went back to the timing in the 2022 date, we began this in early 2019. In terms of, we had to initiate consultations. Consultations are bring all the information together. With all the information, develop what studies need to be done. Again, you might want to look at section 2 of this agreement, talking about development of the studies. And then the idea is to implement the studies here, next year, and the following year, so we complete the package of information necessary to decide steps and information that need to be put into a PME program, and then go to the governor. Governor needs that 8 criteria
Right.
earlier stated.
I understand
And he's
that.
required to
Yeah.
do a balance of that.
Got it. Can I say follow up?
Yeah, I'm sorry, then we missed it.
Okay, great. So just so we understand, is your ultimate attempt, or excuse me, your intent ultimately to release water into the river?
There's no specific direction to release water. The direction is to protect, mitigate, and enhance habitat. So we're going to let the studies lead to what that would be.
So you might do
That
something
may be-
else.
Well, that may be the outcome, and there's a very good chance of that. But we're going to let the studies guide us as to what that is.
Thank you. Ms. Alto?
Thanks. Because MLMP is involved in this, I mean, have we had a municipal legal analysis as to this issue regarding whether or not an immediate flushing flow or immediate release is allowed or not? I mean, do we agree?
My name is Ralph DeWare. I'm with the Municipal Attorney's Office. We have looked at the agreement. We concur that Section 7 is a substantial hurdle from the municipality's point of view. We're not so much concerned about the effort to restore water to the river. We're very concerned about the timing and making sure that we comply, because as was mentioned earlier, that 1991 agreement is binding and enforceable. It can be enforced, so we have to be very careful not to expose municipalities to risk under that agreement. And I can elaborate.
That's fine. I'll follow up offline. Thank you.
Can we go back a couple slides here? I'm interested here. The key date slide in the accelerated projects schedule. So you describe it as, if you go to accelerated project schedule, so you describe it as accelerated, but you have it basically in 2024 submit proposal to the governor. If you go back a slide, aren't you legally required to, in 2024, he issues the final program? So you say it's accelerated, but aren't you basically just ending up at the same time frame?
We may not need all that time, so we started earlier. We also realized once we started that starting in 2022 would have been a pretty compressed schedule if we did. So yes, we threw in 2 years of study, 2 years to prepare the program, but those may not take the entire time.
Okay, but if you go to the next slide, your sort of, it might not take the entire time, but your plan is basically, we're starting early, but come 2024, we'll be back on the legally mandated schedule.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Any other, I guess that's, you have a conclusion slide. Yes.
I have another question too.
Yep.
Just in conclusion.
One more question?
Oh, I'm sorry. We'll do the conclusion,
Go
we'll have
ahead.
Mr. Davis's question.
I'm in the queue as well.
We're following the required
sorry, Chris.
process, 1991. We feel it's a scientific process. It's going to allow the governor to balance all the concerns and values of this project. We started the process 3 years early, and we also have a project website, eklutnahydro.com, a lot of background information, a lot of documentation that we collected up. not everything and not all the studies, but a lot of historical information on that. Also, if you're interested, we provide your email address. We'll send out project updates.
Thank you. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I apologize I don't have a handout of this. It's just on my phone, but it's a NOAA graph that shows that the water level on the lake this fall in September rose and rose and rose, and then it just stuck right at the top, the same amount over days and days. Why didn't the water spill?
There were some rumors out there that maybe utilities were manipulating the water level. We really have no way to manipulate it. The weather is the weather. The only way for us to drain water out of that is through the tunnel and through the turbines. In fact, we have one turbine down for maintenance, so we only had one turbine operating during that period.
So did you put more water during that time down into the tunnel?
No.
So it just happened to stay at that level?
That was, yes, we thought it was going to. That's why we notified everybody, and then I don't know if winter set in or what, but I'm sure it's...
Is there any reason that you wouldn't spill water?
Only as a utility, prudent utility operations is to use that for power production.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
This could be totally incorrect, but my understanding is that the water utility pays for water that you need to generate electricity, but if water's going down that spillway, then they don't have to pay as much or something. So Mark's nodding. So there is an incentive to not let it go.
If water spills, it's free to AWW at that point in time.
All the water that they get at that point is free, or just
During the spill period, that is correct.
Okay, so there is an incentive to not let it go over the spillway.
Well, financially speaking, but the utilities don't.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, our prudent utility operation is to utilize as much power, water we can for power generation. You know, it's our lowest cost power, it's renewable, and we coordinate it with all our other utility activities, and that's how we function. You know, a monetary concern about AWW paying or not paying, that's not meaningful.
So they could not pay, we could take some right.
Yeah, I like free water in my house
talk
too.
later.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time. I'm sorry, Mr. Constant.
Thank you. It's a pretty disheartening to hear some of the attorneys, especially the municipal attorney, put such a firm flag in the ground that our job is to ensure that we don't put any risk on the municipality. And I'm hopeful that we come to a point where instead of allowing this to be an attorney-run process where everyone's in their corner saying, don't risk anything, we could see actual leadership from Mr. Izzo and Mr. Thiebert and from the mayor's office and maybe from the governor's office, so we can show some executive action instead of just a bunch of quibbling attorneys fighting over how we're not going to move. Because it's extraordinarily frustrating to hear fear be the driving principle of this conversation instead of vision. And so I believe that we have visionary leaders running our utilities, and I believe there's a vision in the mayor's office, and I hope we can figure out a way to tap into that, because if we continue to stand in the corners praying for no risk, we're never going to move forward, and I find that very disheartening. And I'll just switch gears altogether onto the topic of vision and speak directly to Mr. Thiebert and say 2 weeks and we know, and it's been an incredible run on this, and my fingers are crossed that vision is accomplished too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mrs. Olitel.
May we get a copy of the 1991 agreement? Can someone track it down and email it out?
If I may, very directly, you can go to eklutnahydro.com.
Perfect.
We have
Great.
all the documents there. It's a very good website with lots of detail.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Under background.
Is there anyone else from the utilities who would like to speak, Mr. Thiebert?
Yeah, I guess I would like to address, we're not driving this thing with the attorneys. We do have an agreement. We will follow the agreement. But really, the best thing we can do is get all the parties at the table and work through the process. And that's what we've been doing, is making sure we have the agencies. You look at the one slide where we have the mandatory agencies. Well, there's been a flood of other people that are interested, and they've been part of the process, and we encourage them all to be part of the process.
And thank you, Lee. I was mostly reacting to what I heard from our municipal attorney, just that we can't expose ourselves to any risk. I think that is a terrible position to start arguing from or negotiating from. Thank you. Again, I do thank you for your hard work on this and especially the MLMP transaction.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Izzo, do you want to say anything?
If I could, good afternoon, I'm Tony Izzo, CEO of Matanuska Electric Association. I just want to reiterate that MEA is committed towards working to a solution on this. It's been said earlier, we've passed a board resolution in support of it. We do have the concern that maybe you can help us with through your own counsel, which is in that section 7, that if we don't follow the study and consultation process, that we could be held liable to federal and state government agencies who are parties to the agreement. So I know maybe that's been disheartening. I've heard that word said. I can understand that. It in no way has slowed us down in wanting to move through this process. But I agree maybe with something I think Assemblyman Constance said, in that we're not allowing attorneys to run this process. But if you can help us with an interpretation that's different than maybe what we're trying to determine, that's great. Anything that will move this along is terrific. But please understand, I think if you were in my shoes, if you thought you were going to violate some federal law and there was going to be a repercussion, I have to be very cautious about that on behalf of my utility and my members.
So my question then is, there are these various parties to this agreement, and there are various federal agencies and state agencies involved. Have any of the parties to the agreement or the state or federal agencies indicated that if you accelerated the process of releasing water, that they would have standing and they would pursue legal action? Who is threatening this legal action?
It's just potential.
Okay. Mr. Weldon?
Thanks, Bob. But if all the parties got together and amended the agreement to say we could speed this up or we could do a couple floods or whatever you call them, everybody's get a big table apparently, but you're all there.
Could you do that?
Well, what I'd like to highlight here, again, we're identifying the issue for everyone here. It's a big hurdle. We're trying to work to overcome it and what we can do, full repercussions and act of Congress elements. We don't fully understand. It's something we need to work through. We want to work through the agencies. We want to work through the interested parties. We need to, again, it's a big hurdle. That's not the only hurdle. We don't have permits to utilize water for other purposes. There's liability downstream. These all have to be worked out. I understand that, and I appreciate and hear the issue about trying to get water into this river now. We have to work through what is in this agreement that we all committed ourselves to.
Well, not all of us.
Yeah.
Some people weren't even consulted when it happened. Okay. Well, I think with that, we're past our time. I'm going to close this work session. Thank you all for coming.